Thank you very much for coming to the conference, and I am very pleased to have the opportunity to speak for the first time at one of the Theosophical History conferences. Janet's given the title of my talk, so I think I will just proceed directly. So the book Thought Forms is considered a kind of icon, both in the Theosophical Society and also in the art history world. This is the title page of the first edition. Notice that the copyright date is 1905. There was a long confusion about the copyright date. Many older books cite it as 1901. John Crow, who was with us about 10 years ago, published an article correcting that, and yet he was still only saying probably at that time, and the discoveries of the diaries that I will be talking about today definitively place the book within 1905, finished in 1904, published in 1905. So what is a thought form? These are clairvoyantly perceived experiences of thoughts that are in a sense concretized into some visual expression. Now here we have two, a vague religious feeling, an essentially not fully formed thought form. We have self-renunciation looking like a lotus flower, both blue, which is supposedly the color of religious devotion. And in theosophical teaching, we are constantly creating these at the astral or sometimes mental level of being, and these are being projected, absorbed, and clairvoyants supposedly can see them forming and moving and being absorbed by other people. So thought forms was an attempt to bring this clairvoyant experience to the mind of the public in a visual graphic form. Now, the main focus of my research is on the collaborators that were involved in producing the book. There's a foreword that explains who those collaborators were. The known collaborators are Annie Besant, who eventually became the second international president of the Theosophical Society 2 years later in 1907. Charles Webster Leadbeater, a well-known clairvoyant within the society. John Varley, who was a painter, who was responsible for creating thought forms at the instruction of Besant Leadbeater for an article published in 1896, which introduced the idea to the larger public. And a man mentioned, an architect by the name of Frederick Bly Bond. Much is known about him as a psychic archaeologist who was doing work at Glastonbury later in the 20th century. And then there were several unknown collaborators. One was a Miss McFarlane, who I've been able to identify as an American painter, Eugenia Hargis McFarlane, although there was an earlier attempt to identify her as a Lady McFarlane under the impression that she was a wealthy Scottish theosophical member who never existed. Problematically, there is also a Mr. Prince who was mentioned as a collaborator. It turns out that Prince was a typographical error or possibly a misreading of a manuscript for a gentleman, an English gentleman named Thomas Tertius Prime. Tertius meaning that he was the third with the same name. There was Anonymous, of course, which we can't say very much about. And then the writer of the diaries that I will be presenting to you, Walter Basil Hodgson Smith, who was directly involved in the transcription of Leadbeater's dictation that produced the manuscript for the book. And a completely unknown collaborator by the name of Bruce Gordon Kingsley, who was a British musician who came to work in America and who collaborated with Leadbeater on the investigations, the psychic investigations for the music forms, which come at the end of the book. Music forms that are based on clairvoyant perception of pieces by Mendelssohn, Gounod, and Wagner. So let me introduce you now to Walter Basil Hodgson Smith. Here's a picture of him, 1887 to 1929. He met Leadbeater when he was very young in 1896, and his past lives were investigated under the name Viga. Joined the TS in 1897, so he was only 10 years old at that time. He began traveling as a kind of secretary with Leadbeater and did this for many years. He was featured in 1899 in the book Invisible Helpers under the name Cyril, where his astral experiences were described by Leadbeater. And then there was an extensive period of travel, 1900 to 1906, where he went through Africa, Europe, New Zealand, Australia, Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, India, Burma, and Egypt in the company of Leadbeater and several others. And the diaries that I'll be talking about document every day, starting with the first day of 1903 through the end of 1906. They actually go beyond that, but the entire itinerary of this trip, this round the world trip, is included. He went on after there was a Leadbeater scandal. Leadbeater resigned. He was a little lost, you could say. Some people put up the money to help him get private tutoring so he could go to university. And he attended Worcester College in Oxford. For a little while, he was a tutor of Jiddu Krishnamurti, became a librarian at the TS England headquarters in London, was actively involved in World War I, beginning as a second lieutenant, becoming eventually captain. After the war was over, he obtained his master's degree, he married, and he became the librarian and secretary of the new University Club, which was a club for elites in London. And he held that position for the rest of his life. It's not clear exactly how he died. It's thought that he experienced some serious challenges to his health during the war, and that this may have contributed. So I'm going to speak now about the provenance of the diaries that I'll be talking about. So they came from Basil to his wife, Ethel Dorothy Hodgson Smith. From there, they went to Fritz Kunz, who was his traveling companion, an American theosophist who was a very young person who traveled with Leadbeater around the world and was working along with, or side by side as a secretary with Basil. The diaries were discovered by Fritz shortly after Dorothy died, 1953, in a London bookshop. And he would have recognized them because, of course, he traveled with Basil, and so it was immediately apparent to him that these were something that he wanted to acquire and then pass on for the history of the Theosophical Society. John Kunz was Fritz Kunz's son. He had them for a while. Then when he passed on, his wife, a Finnish woman, Aino, had them. And then before Aino died, Nicholas van Gelder, who was a nephew of Dora van Gelder, who many of you know of, another clairvoyant within the Theosophical Society, first cousin of John Kunz, happened to be digging around in the basement of John Kunz's house and rediscovered these diaries and was given them by Aino. And they are promised to be delivered eventually to the Theosophical Society in their archives. So I've been involved in a documentation project since June. I visited with Nicholas. It was the first opportunity after the pandemic that I could do this. He was kind enough to give me the diaries I needed to look at for the sake of making a photographic record and a transcription. I've managed to transcribe the 1903 and 1904 diaries, which pertain to thought forms. I've made a photographic record of the round the world trip. The diaries from 1907 and 1908 are not so interesting because every entry begins, had a lesson, talked in French to Mademoiselle, learned some algebra, and not much of interest to theosophical history. But when he would go to London, he would meet with the famous theosophists. And so there are records of these meetings, which are very interesting. So to summarize the diaries very, very quickly, Leadbeater's second American tour is contained within 1903-04. That's the focus of my paper. The tour of Hawaii, New Zealand, Australia, Ceylon, India, Burma, return to England via Egypt, the aftermath of the scandal where Leadbeater resigned, and some indications of where Leadbeater was located during the period of exile, which is somewhat of a blank period in most people's understanding of his biography, are contained in the 1907 and 1908 diaries. Nicholas van Gelder wrote a Theosophical History occasional paper that has not yet been published that documents the diaries of the Around the World trip. And I'm hoping that in the transition of the Theosophical History journal that this will be revisited, because it's a very worthwhile paper. It's the paper where I was able to do the detective work that helped me understand that there would be information about thought forms in these diaries. So Basil went on to the private tutoring, that's 1907. Annie Besant's lectures in London are covered. The period when Leadbeater was doing clairvoyant investigations of occult chemistry in Germany are also covered. 1908, similar structure, another visit to Leadbeater. From this point, in a sense, they become a little less interesting. No diary in 1909. 1910 and through 13 university life, meetings with theosophical people, the work with Krishnamurti. The diary breaks off in 1915 after his period of working in the Theosophical Society in England and Wales, headquarters in London. And then, of course, towards the end of the year, he was summoned up for service in the British Army in the Officer Training Corps. There's quite a lot of non-diary records in the form of letters and an autobiography of his war years. These are in the archives of the Theosophical Society in America, as I explained here. And then the diaries finally resume in 1919 to 1928. I have it on the report of Nicholas, the custodian of the diaries, that there is absolutely no mention of anything theosophical in that entire period. So a few words about Basil as a diarist. You have to understand there are certain limitations about the kind of information you can find in these diaries. Date, location, tonnage, and weather. Tonnage needs some explanation. Whenever Basil was on a ship, he always recorded how much the ship weighed. And so there was a question when I was explaining this to someone over a meal here that perhaps he was on the autistic spectrum, and that may be so. Daily routines, waking up, bathing, meals, bedtimes are recorded. Work activities, correspondence, book dictation, transcription, publishing, travel and lodging arrangements, visitors, branch meetings of the Theosophical Society, public lectures of Leadbeater, recreational activities, excursions, swimming, lots and lots of tennis, writing lessons, games, reading. They love to read Sherlock Holmes, for example, so this is recorded. What is virtually absent are any thoughts, any feelings, and any accounts of occult work. So this is very much a record of the externals of life. Here we have the front covers of the two journals in question from 1903, 1904, Knowledge Diary and Scientific Handbook. So about 100 pages of the diaries are biographies of scientists and the latest discoveries in science from the year before and such things. So let me now introduce to you the painter that's involved in thought forms, Eugenia Harvest McFarland Balch, Balch being her married name. She first comes into the awareness in the diaries on this page where Miss McFarland and Miss Bartholomew from Philadelphia arrived this morning and were in time for the second meeting, which happened to be a meeting of the esoteric school. So March 1903 is the earliest record we have of her. It's not known when she joined the Theosophical Society. I've not found her record in the Theosophical Society Adyar register. Here is the only image I currently have of her, although I'm working to obtain others. This is a painting of her that was done by one of her teachers in Paris by the name of Humbert. So a quick tour of her life. Her father died in 1885. He was an oil and coal geologist, and therefore there was a lot of wealth in the family. Towanda, Pennsylvania is in the hill country west of Philadelphia. It's rather an obscure place. She went to Vassar College and got a school of painting artist diploma. Her mother died in 1888. This is important so you understand that she was independently wealthy. In 1890 to 94, she studies at the Académie Julian, Paris. She had teachers that many, many famous painters from America studied with, Lefebvre and Robert Fleury. There was an unwanted pregnancy documented in letters, an attempt to find an abortion. I have not yet been able to see the archive where this information is contained. She has exhibited profusely, I suppose you could say, in Paris at various salons. She moved to the Académie Montparnasse and studied with Aman Yan. He was interested in occultism and was involved with a circle of occultists around Péladan in Paris. And she there earned the nickname Trilby, which some of you will recognize as the name of a novel by the English author George de Maurier. And it's interesting because Trilby was the subject of an evil hypnotist by the name of Svengali. And this, I suppose, is the beginning of her interest in occultism. And you could almost say later that she became such a groupie, so to speak, of Leadbeater, that was her Svengali.
2 moments. 2 moments.
Ah, okay, well, I cannot even really go to the documentation of the actual outline of what happened with the Thought Forms book, but let me introduce Thomas Tertius Prime very briefly. Here's the only picture I've been able to find of him. He was the heir of a silversmith company which went bankrupt. He studied the Birmingham and Midlands Institute, possibly there being exposed to art. Again, I'll go very quickly through all of these. Tragic life, wife went insane. The partnership was dissolved. Father died. He joined the TS in Chicago, trying to reinvent his life, and became a traveler, lecturing throughout the Theosophical Society. The marriage was annulled. He remarried. Well, you get the idea. I have a handle on the what's going on with the lives of these people. Bruce Gordon Kingsley, I mentioned that he was the organist. What I tried to document in this talk was the actual day-by-day outline of what happened with the formation of the book, to demonstrate that it was recorded in diary entries such as this one. Here's a portrait of Bruce Gordon Kingsley. I will skip all of this information. I want to go to the last slide. So it's known that, okay, here we go. It's known that Eugenia McFarlane, Basil Hodgson-Smith, and CWL Leadbeater went on a tour of Yellowstone National Park in 1903. And here we have a vintage photograph of one of the geysers, and we have one of the Thought Forms pictures. The geysers come in 2 forms. One is an expression of steam, the other is an expression of pressurized water. How does it change our perception of these paintings to know that there is this background recorded in the diaries? Here's another one. Here's one of the ones that is expelling pressurized water, and you can see the similarity to the Wagner the Gounod thought form painting. So sorry about the abbreviated form of the talk. If people are interested, I can send them a PDF of the slides so that you can actually look at the documentation and so on. So I'll try to get a list of the people who are in attendance and send that out. So thank you for your attention.